Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Stephen Adler, and I am the Executive Director of the Canadian Friends of Tel Aviv University in Ontario and Western Canada. Prior to us starting the webinar, I just want to take a moment to update all of you on some of the incredible work that is presently being done at Tel Aviv University, including that research being done by Professor Moti Gerlich and Ariel Munotz, who you may have seen recently in the news for having developed a quick and accurate method for acute screening for COVID-19, with an initial study focusing on IDF soldiers, as well as Dr. Adi Stern's research, which has played a vital role in Israel being able to map the virus's genome. These are just examples from two of the more than 150 researchers and their teams currently working on COVID-19 related matters on campus. And to those of you who have already supported our Drop Everything campaign, we thank you. The Canadian Friends of Tel Aviv University, along with our friends from around the world, have been offering webinars over the past few weeks as a way of staying connected and to help keep our minds stimulated and entertained. And now we can turn our focus on our topic this afternoon, the future of food. With all this in mind, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our moderator today, Rose Reisman. Rose is an award-winning entrepreneur, caterer, author, and media personality, not to mention a mother of four. As a registered nutritional consultant armed with an MBA, Rose has taken her passion for healthy living and developed it into a multifaceted enterprise, making her one of Canada's leading authorities on the art of eating and living well. She is committed to changing the eating habits of Canadians. Rose is a sought-after speaker, spokesperson, media personality, and regular newspaper author. Her 20th cookbook, wow, 20, good for you, Rose, which was released during COVID, is focused on Canada's food guide. She is the owner of Rose Reisman Catering, which focuses on healthy cuisine for over 400 corporate and social clients across Canada. She also owns Personal Gourmet and Paleo Meals, a fresh and frozen individual meal plan. Understanding the importance of nutrition at an early age, Rose launched a kids' lunch program, providing hot and healthy meals to schools in the Greater Toronto Area, serving more than 1,500 children daily. Rose is also the restaurant consultant for the light menus at the Pickle Barrel restaurant chain here locally. Thank you very much, Rose, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm looking forward to hearing from our two panelists who can shed some light on the food industry. Each panelist will speak for approximately 15 minutes. Following their talks, we'll have a Q&A period where you'll be able to ask questions via the chat function. Please send your questions in a chat directly to me, Rose Reisman, as I will be moderating the Q&A. I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Professor Nir Ohad. Professor Nir Ohad received his Bachelor of Science in Biology and Earth Sciences and his Master in Science and PhD in Genetics from Hebrew University. Professor Nir Ohad has been a member of Tel Aviv University's School of Plant Sciences and Food Security since 1998, a leader in his field. Professor Ohad is studying the role of DNA and histone methylation as part of epigenetic regulation during plant reproduction and development. And he'll define what all of that is, because I'm sure many of us don't know. He's also published author and a highly regarded editor. Appointed in 2014, Professor Ohad has been the head of the Mana Center Program for Safety and Security, MCPFSS, at Tel Aviv University, a leading institute leveraging scientific and technological innovation towards solving the most pressing needs locally and globally for sufficient and nutritious food. The center focuses on long-term solutions for food security requiring advances in biological sciences and agriculture, as well as the evaluation of food policies in the area of economics, law, and business practices. Ran Goel. Ran Goel is CEO and founder of Fresh City, a Toronto urban farm and organic retailer. Some of his informative childhood experiences include his grandmother's stories about growing up on a kibbutz, feeling democracy awaken in his childhood home of South Africa, and the mum stuffed peppers. Ran has spoken on food issues before hundreds of audiences. He proudly leads a team of over 250 staff as they collectively create a better life through food. Before founding Fresh City, Ran practiced investment law in New York City for several years. Ran is a Tel Aviv University alum, 2007 Faculty of Law year course. Professor Olan?
Well, thank you very much.
Nir Ohad.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So first, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Rose, and also Stephen for the invitation to attend this webinar. I'd like to start from the personal perspective, tell you what we have gone through here in Israel in the last 3 months during the COVID-19 epidemic, then go to the country level, and from there, a short view on what we can see internationally. So we've just came out from almost 3 months of a lockdown here in Israel. And when it started about 3 months ago at the end of January, beginning of February, I think Israel was among the first to close and shut down all international traffic airplanes into Israel, which was probably the most significant way to avoid the spread in the country. Relatively speaking, the country has suffered quite few losses relative to other countries, but a huge economical toll, which we can see elsewhere around the world. So close to March, when groceries and other supplies started to become low, it seems that there was actually a huge demand for two major things, which really surprised everybody. The first item you wouldn't guess would be toilet paper. So supermarkets just ran out of toilet paper, and of course the most needed thing aside of that was pasta, flour, rice, all the hard stocks that people can store for cooking at home ran out quickly. Similar to what Stephen had just told us on our entry to the session, that in Canada you had something similar where you cannot find bagged flour because people have just stocked them all. And of course, Canada is one of the most biggest producers of flour. There should be no lack of supply, but this is part of what happens when there's a panic on an epidemic or in a crisis. The bottlenecks are not just the stocks themselves, it's the chain of supply, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So during this last 2 or 3 months we've just passed, my family and I decided I will take care of my mother, who is 90 years old, who lives by herself, still at home. And of course, we've banned her from going out of home, and I've cooked for her. I went for groceries. I went to take all the medical stuff that she needed all along that time, and we passed that time. So it tells us that yes, we have needs for food, but food is not everything at the end. We need the social part. And why do I say that? Because we see the impact now when finally today restaurants were reopened after almost 3 months. You see the crave of people to meet and feed each other, talk to each other, hug each other, which had a tremendous effect on all of us. In Israel itself, and I think this is worldwide, the pressure of staying at home gave its toll on intermarriage relation, on violence among families. So the epidemic had a huge toll and impact on the economical part, on the social part. And we had to try and cope with that at the personal level first and foremost. Another anecdote, already at the first month of closure, we had to choose who will go to groceries. We tried to minimum the risk, so I was the one who had to go to the groceries. And it's interesting that when you go outside and you know you had a list of what you need to shop for, the minute you see a short queue on any of the shops you want to shop through, even it's just by chance, you immediately go in queue because you know that that's the way you'll be able to get what you want with the less crowded situation. Interestingly, that brought us the thought of what happened in the period of the communist regime behind the Iron Curtains, where people would queue for days for just one item at horrible and difficult times, which cannot be compared. But this is the associate. This is the what people would reflect on. So during this time of the COVID time here in Israel, aside from the lockdown, we had some severe cases in dense populated neighborhoods in different cities, which required them to be under tighter closure. And then we had a case where then people could not support elder people, lonely people. And here, aside from NGOs, the military joined the force to start and distribute food to people who are with need. So we see how the community joined together, is recruited to help their neighbors, but you need an upper view of the situation and to find solution to help people with whatever resources we had. So this is the second level of arrangement. Of course, there was a new arrangement for headquarters at the national level to look into all the medical needs, but also at the food supply level. And the situation gave its toll also on small farmers, though they're not poor farmers, but all of a sudden farmers could not pick their crops, and it didn't reach the market. They suffered heavy losses, and instead what the major chains did was to import tomatoes. Though we have excess of tomatoes, cheap tomatoes were brought from Turkey at that point, and this was a very fine example of how management and policy making needs to take place under crisis. To whom do you care? Do you care to your own farmers? Do you care for the price of market? And the same thing happened for eggs. There is enough eggs in Israel, but due to huge demand, especially before the Passover holiday, where people were under the need for eggs to the holiday, it just ran out from all the supermarkets. They had to bring planes with eggs from Poland, from other places in Europe, where we do have the capacity of producing enough eggs to the entire population, simply because people were stocking eggs more than they needed. So again, this brings us to the chain of supply and people behavior. So from here, I want to move to tell you very shortly about what the Manna Center does in order to advance food security here in Israel and worldwide. And we do this through three different pillars of action. It's education, research, and outreach, part of what I'm doing right now with you. Research is actually interdisciplinary. We engage with researchers on campus from all disciplines, whether it's law, archaeology, technology, engineering, of course, the life sciences, the medical sciences, and to bring together people, researchers, that would never thought to engage with the people from the other side of campus to develop detectors or devices that can allow sensing plants in the field, letting us know when they're under acute conditions. So this is, for instance, an ongoing project between a plant biologist in my department and an electrical microengineer who are devising or developing sensors that will sense plant behavior. So this is just in a nutshell, a small example of what we're doing in the center. Our educational program, on the other hand, has an international program from third world countries to bring students who would never had the chance to come and get a fine education at Tel Aviv University on food security and plant biology. For the last 6 years, we had over 100 graduates, master program students, that went back to their countries from more than 8 different countries in Africa and Vietnam and India. And I wanted to share with you very shortly a short letter that I just got over this weekend. And this is from a student from our last cohort. He said, I hope all is fine with you and your family amidst the COVID-19. Liberia had less than 300 cases, I think death he means, since then. Amidst the health challenges, I was able to fund an organization that has focused in science and agriculture. Can't forget the labeled impact of Israel Moshav made on my life. And I've named my organization Moshav Liberia Agriculture Networks Mulan. What a fine name. Where he's now training people for agriculture, and he's now generated a public service over the radio for agriculture education, which goes through 300,000 farmers who lack basic skills and field crop practices. So he says that Israel and Tel Aviv University and YACAT are partner in the Arava, where he was trained for agriculture, are highly appreciated by citizens in my country for these innovations. And this is what we call Tikkun Olam. A few students can go really far. This educational program has the ability to impact many people by educating the next generation of leaders. And Jacob, this student, is one of them. Even more so at the period of world epidemic, especially vulnerable countries such in Africa, where aid organizations had to leave the country and left behind the needed organizations, such educated people from Israel and elsewhere, other programs around the world who are trained and can fill in the gap to support and advise are really crucial. So I'm really proud of this program and our graduates who are doing such a great job. And this is part of how we try to impact not only Israel, but also worldwide. We have such programs in India, in other countries other than Liberia and Africa. So this is part of what we're doing. And moving to the upper level, in March, I think it was either the end of March or beginning of April, the head of the FAO, the Food World Organization, Dominic Bergman, was interviewed. And the topic of that interview was COVID-19, our hungriest, most vulnerable communities face a crisis within a crisis. And he described there that we know that among the 7 billion people around the world, there's about 1 billion people who are vulnerable and are less food secured, but there are really at least 135 million people, according to this interview, who are already struggling with acute food insecurity. And the prediction was that due to the COVID-19 epidemic, this number might increase and double due to the lack of food security in poor communities, mainly agriculture communities in Mid-Africa, Central Africa, and West Africa. And the fear was that if they would not be assisted supporting with food supply, migration of people to the cities might start, and then the epidemic might be increased. And this will generate a problem that will not only be sustained after the COVID, would not be eradicated only during the COVID-19 epidemic, but could last and generate a huge problem after the epidemic will be over. So looking into food security and worldwide, which is one of the aims of the UN through the FAO, is a major task. We know that, and this is also one of the issues, that we know that there is enough basic food resources in the world. The question is, will countries, as some countries already announced, will stock them and prevent selling to other countries? such as wheat and rice, which may cause a shortage of supply to other countries, increasing prices. And in view of the lack of income, the epidemic affects millions of people income only in Israel, and I know also in the States. I'm less familiar with Canada. In the last 2 months, the increase in unemployment went from 10% to almost 25%. Out of the 4 million workforce in Israel, 1 million people went out of labor. So, and in the States, this has also been increased up to 17%. So it's going to have a huge impact on the purchase power of people to maintain their ability to support their needs. And just as an example, it was reported yesterday that in Israel, at least 50% of the households have reduced by half their purchase of food. So people are really looking into what their plan and how they're going to go over this period of hard time. And food is one of the things that is most vulnerable. And we know that we cannot afford losing our nutrition because this is the base for our existence.
Professor, I wanted to thank you. If you'd like to say just a couple more words, please bring it to an end.
Yeah, just the final word that we recently submitted a white paper to our Higher Council of the country related to food security and national security, which offered a short-term, mid-term, and long-term plan to assure food security based on adequate nutrition and putting in place a central government organization that would look into, first, look into the data, research the situation, then make a plan, and then look into the implementation of it nationwide. So I think this is probably relevant to all countries.
Thank you. Professor Nir Ohad, thank you so much. I'd like to pass this over now to Ran Goel.
Hi there. Probably a bit of background would be helpful. So yeah, my name is Ran. I run a company here in Toronto called Fresh City, and we have exposure to the whole food value chain, if you will. So we've kind of seen a lot of changes through COVID. So we are an urban farm. We farm in a couple of locations in the city. We are a food processor. So we make a lot of our own prepared foods, breads. We butcher whole animals. And we're a retailer as well. We retail through our 8 stores as well as online, which the majority of our revenue is online. So we've kind of experienced, I feel like, a big part of the spectrum of the impact of COVID. Certainly a lot you could say. It's been a wild ride as an entrepreneur during COVID. Very stressful, interesting time. But I'd like to focus a bit on the kind of some of the things that stand out to me. I'd say if I would have to summarize it, I think what COVID has done from our business's perspective, what I've seen is this almost unveiling of what's under the hood of the food system. So I think what to me has been interesting is a lot of issues that are near or dear to me and why I started Fresh City in the first place to kind of promote organic and local food and healthy food. A lot of those issues have really come to the forefront. And you see that in terms of, people are now focusing more on obviously cooking from home much more and are actually conscious of the food choices they've made. So if you kind of rewind 3 months ago, the average person walks into a supermarket and it's full of, whether in Israel or in Canada, or most of the sort of industrialized world, you have food from all over the world, something that our grandparents could only have dreamed of. You have 40 or 50,000 SKUs, and you can have a basic belief that is confirmed by reality that this food is bountiful and it's always going to be there. So you can go and choose your Gala apple, or you can choose your Roma tomato, and it's basically always there. So I think there's an element during COVID where you see these shortages, certainly of eggs and flour, but of other items as well, where people start realizing, hey, there's a whole thing under the hood here to get the food here. It doesn't just magically appear. And that might sound like it's a small thing, but to me, it's really the reason I started Fresh City is reading about the food system and how there is actually a lot of vulnerabilities that we're not sort of aware of, and that ultimately all that stands between us and starvation is 6 inches of topsoil and a farmer. So some of the things that stand out to me is that I think most people don't realize about our modern food system is first and foremost, or I should say first, is how concentrated our meat processing is, certainly in North America. So in Canada, 3 plants are responsible for something like 90% of beef processing. And they've been particularly vulnerable to COVID outbreaks, given how close workers in those beef plants work. And I think that's a bit of a, it's a glimpse to how concentrated our food system, again, certainly North America I could speak to, has become, whether it's at the retail level, where you have a handful of national grocery stores that control most of the grocery dollar, where at the processing level, most acute in meat processing, but you see it throughout, or at the production level, where you're seeing certain a small set of companies controlling fertilizer and seed production, and in various other parts of the value chain process. So I think the one thing that first and foremost this has brought out is that concentration, and in the case of meat processing in particular, how vulnerable it is to disruption. So that's the first thing that I think I found very interesting, and you can see it. The other part is and you can see it in North America in particular, is the reliance on migrant labor to bring food to the table. In Canada, we've had we rely on tens of thousands of migrant laborers to come. I think Israel's got a similar kind of migrant agricultural labor workforce. And once their movement across borders was restricted, it has a huge impact on our ability to produce and harvest food, in particular fresh food, produce, which is no matter the advances over the last century of agriculture, there's still quite a bit of manual labor still with a lot of produce production, vegetables and fruit in particular. So we've seen farmers crying out for help from the government to create speedier processes to allow people to come in from Jamaica or from Mexico for the labor that they've provided. We've certainly seen that in the organic produce sector here in Ontario, close to Toronto. So that's the other thing that's kind of been really, really interesting to see kind of under the hood. Associated with that, and Professor Ohad spoke about this a bit, is the huge shifts in demand. And I think we've seen this firsthand. You've seen a huge shift in demand from people shopping bricks and mortar to shopping online. In our case, we've seen a 4x increase in online volumes, and even there it was as a result of having to waitlist customers. And I think that obviously speaks to the particular set of circumstances during COVID, where people are trying to hunker at home and not go out if they don't have to. But my sense of it, and certainly a lot of the people I speak to, is this kind of represents an acceleration of a pre-existing trend of people shopping for groceries online more. The kind of penetration rates we were forecasting, beginning of the year, something that would take 5 years has been compressed into 2 or 3 months. And I think that shift is there to stay with us. In particular, we found older demographics, which have been reluctant to shop online, have moved online in a big way, especially because they're the most vulnerable segment for COVID. So I think that's one thing we've seen. I think we'll continue seeing as a result of COVID. The other huge shift, and I think this kind of again shows you kind of how far we've come as a culture, is how much of our food is now consumed outside of the home. Certainly in restaurants, but also cafeterias and other places like that. So in Canada, something like 40% of our food dollars now go to restaurants. And what you see during COVID is this huge shift, basically to people having to cook food at home, has created certain bottlenecks in the supply chain that have taken a few weeks, and it will take a couple more months to really iron out, so that the eggs that used to come in cartons of, say, 36 now have to come in dozens or 72. I think that's a huge shift. But I think more to the point is, if you think, for me growing up, going to a restaurant was a huge treat. It wasn't something that, you just did every day. Whereas today, even, the bottom, say, quartile of the income pyramid, eating out has become much more accessible. And I think what kind of like COVID kind of shows you is, I think it highlights how much our culture has changed to kind of a convenience format in such a short time. But my hope was what it will show as well is that that convenience has come at a huge cost financially, but probably more important in terms of nutrition. So a lot of the food that we get through food service, frankly, is not the best quality food. It's not the most nutritious. And my hope is that we get to a place where you can, you don't need to dig very far to get nutritious food outside of your home when all said and done. So that's the other big sort of shift in demand we've seen. The other thing I want to highlight as a kind of last big topic that has come up for us certainly is what COVID has, I think, highlighted is how badly, frankly, labor has been treated across the food value chain, from farm workers to workers working in food processing plants to grocery workers on the front line. So we've come to this strange place where you work in cash at a grocery store and you're a hero, and that was unimaginable 3 months ago that this kind of work would be valorized and thought of as courageous and having this big value add. But my hope certainly is that this as a society causes us to reflect. And in Canada, we've seen this in long-term care homes where we've entrusted just here in Ontario 80,000 people to these long-term care homes, and we've seen 1,000 fatalities because of the lack of safeguards and, frankly, I think the lack of sufficient funding for these institutions. But we see that mirrored in the food space, where the reigning kind of paradigm over the last 50 years in Canada, North and the U.S. has been how do we pay less for food, which in and of itself is not a bad thing, but we've forgotten what we lose often when we're aiming for less and less food. So, Canada and the U.S. are one of the lowest per capita spenders on food in the world, and that has come at a cost. And it's come at a cost of how we treat our labor in the food system. It's come at a cost of the quality of the food that we put in our mouths, both in terms of the impact it's having in our own bodies and the impact it's having ecologically on the environment as well. So my hope is that there is this moment now where food is certainly in Canada for the first time seen as an issue worth thinking about and as a political issue at the end of the day. And my hope is that whether it's at the federal level or we have provinces here at the state level in the States, policymakers pay attention to it much more than they have, and it's not something that's just taken for granted that the sun will come up in the morning and the shelves in the supermarket will be full.
Great. And would you like to summarize if that's it, Fran, for you?
Yeah, that's. I'm happy to answer.
Thank you. So I'd now like to open up the floor for any questions you may have for one or all of the speakers. Please indicate which speaker you would like to address if possible, and please send your questions directly to me in the chat. And I know we have a question now for Nir. You talked about the farmers who were not allowed to pick their crop in Israel at the start of the lockdown. What role does a government play in ensuring food does not go to waste?
Well, it's not that they were not allowed, simply could not harvest their food. They didn't have enough workers, and there was a huge competition with the big chains who simply bought those supplies from abroad. The government should have a role in it, and this is one of the major issues that's on dispute, to what extent the government should interfere on this particular issue, which is unsolved yet. That's what I can tell you. And one of the things on our agenda that we have added into this white paper I've mentioned in the closer of my presentation is to take care exactly of that, that we should put this on priority. I also wanted to add on one of the things that Rand mentioned, I think, which is really important, and that is the fact that we had for the last 2-3 months the opportunity to eat together, and we tend to say that a family that eats together is a family that will have a healthier life. So our social behavior, we had the chance to go back to our roots in our social behavior, and cooking together. It is a wonderful mean of education. It is a wonderful mean for interaction, which I think under the mouse race of in our life, we tend to put aside because we have the convenience of eating outside, as you just mentioned. And I hope that people will take this step and re-cherish it and continue with it.
Right. Yeah, I think that's, I mean, I know as a nutritionist myself, that's very important because I see even my children, you know, they all have tough jobs and they're running and they're grabbing food and they eat healthy, but there's nothing going on in the home at times about teaching and actually cooking from scratch. So if there's anything, when I look at my 4 children now, it's really wonderful to see them actually cooking and doing what's healthier, what is out there. So that is great. Another question either to either one of you, can you see a time where countries are able to feed themselves from internal means only to ensure food quality and security?
I'm happy to take a quick crack at it. So it's interesting, you know, one of the big focuses for us as a company is promoting local food. But I always say, you know, feeding ourselves from our own like political borders is not an end in and of itself, and I don't think we should try to have complete food independence. So, for example, in Canada, because of the climate, we don't grow bananas, we don't grow avocados, we don't grow oranges, and I can't live without any of those. That said, I think we got to be a bit more strategic about what we grow where. So, for example, you know, there we have some of the most fertile land in the world right here in Southern Ontario in Canada, and meanwhile we're often importing, say, tomatoes from places like California, which have huge water shortages, and then Mexico, which also have huge water shortages. So I do think there's an element of food sovereignty that each country needs to be able to afford its citizens. And, you know, coming from Israel, I'm, you know, very sensitive to that, given the geopolitical situation. But I think we've come to a place where, certainly in Canada, where 80% of your produce is imported. I don't think that's a good place. So whether we need to produce 100%, I don't think so. But whether we only produce 20%, I don't think that's a good place to be either.
Right. The climate is everything. It's so true, huh? Ran, another question for you. What work have you done on organic waste processing to get nutrients back into the food system? Have you explored composting?
Yeah, so we took a kind of a multi-pronged approach. So first and foremost, one of the main reasons we actually started a prepared food program is to have an outlet for any produce that wasn't marketable because of just aesthetic concerns. So a lot of it we try to not even end up having to compost. And then yes, the other part is we do compost both on our farm and in our stores. We actually, it's funny you ask, we're currently planning a bigger composting system for our new farm at the Downsview Park, which would be bigger, to be able to handle all of our own organic matter in-house for the 10 acres we're going to have under production.
If I may add to the previous question, so in terms of independence of food security among different countries, I think in many countries it would be unachievable due to different constraints, space, land, and climate. So very few countries can actually reach complete independence. And therefore globalization in the positive manner of coordinating and interaction needs to be in place. So, you know, Israel, for instance, is not self-sustained in terms of grain production. We have to import our grains, both for our bread and for animal fed. We are self-sustained in all other aspects of, at least in vegetables and fruits. But there are countries which have to import almost 100% of their food supply. So we have to take into account the situation and be more reluctant, not reluctant, but to be more open globally, especially under this epidemic situation, to increase the interaction between nations and to realize that we need to help each other at the end.
Right, and I can ask just a question. If, you know, how long this goes on, no one knows. What do you both foresee if this goes on another year? How will that affect? Talked about that, but if you want to elaborate on that in terms of, you know, let's say around your customers, food supply near.
Nir, you wanna go first, or I'm happy to?
Yeah, I'll go first. So I think we have to look at this at the different levels, from the personal level, the family household, then to the community nationwide, and then internationally. Obviously, at the personal level and the household level, people will look into their budget and see what is what is on their horizon. As I just mentioned, people are starting to reduce their consumption. This is worldwide. It's not only in Israel, because of the expectance of lack of income. So this is going to affect our purchase power. But we have to be aware, and this is where education needs to take place, that this would not affect the nutrition value of what we're going to buy. And this is very important. At the nation and international level, we go back to what we just discussed, that there is a place here for coordination to assure that food supply on the most vulnerable and most demanded and important parts of our food diet would not be locked, would not be prevented. And this is something that can be done already now in place. We don't have to wait for a year for that. We need to start coordinating this at the moment.
I think one of the hats I wear is, you know, I took economics in my graduate studies, and one of the things that interests me about this pandemic is that it imposes a set of constraints that weren't there before. So you see, for example, in a place like Israel, and this dating back to the roots of the country, but because of the geopolitical constraints, there was always this importance of growing food internally, and that drove policy, that drove all sorts of policy that I think a lot of Israelis take for granted, that there are these various structures that promote local food production, or at least historically promote food production. And if you look at a place like, so for example, we're an urban farm. One of the for the more kind of left-leaning urban farmers, they often look at Cuba as an example, because Cuba, a lot of the food in Havana is grown in Havana. A lot of the food consumed in Havana is grown in Havana. And the reason why is they had a huge supply shock when the Soviet Union went down, and they suddenly didn't have much economic support, and they didn't have parts to change the tractors and things like that. And suddenly they had to produce a lot of food internally. So what a lot of people look at as this like a paradise of urban farming was actually just this external constraint. They had to grow their food. So when I look at it like through that lens, what I see at least is I do think there's going to be certainly a short, medium-term trend away from eating food outside the home, and that's going to have obviously a huge impact on this on restaurants and various forms of food service that we're going to have to deal with. I think to Nir's point, I think with given unemployment and given lower incomes, I do think people are going to start looking at food waste a bit more carefully. And again, like we for years we've been talking about how if food waste was a country, I think it would be the biggest country or the second biggest country in terms of food consumption. So I do think you're going to see people think much harder about how they use their food to make sure their food dollar goes as far as possible. So I think, but beyond that, I think my question is, how do you leverage the pandemic, and this is for us as consumers, but also as policymakers, to make our food system more sustainable? And I think that means, at least I hope that means, better support for labor in the food system, and more thought into the ecological consequences of how we grow our food.
If I may, I just wanted to add one more thing. I mean, we've been focusing, I think, mainly on the Western world and more developed countries, but as I've pointed out on the FAO note on the poor countries, that's I think where the most vulnerable populations are, and they cannot, they don't have a buffer to cope with lasting crisis. And if those regions where small subsidiary farmers will need to leave their land, this will be disastrous. There has to be care and a plan of action to help those countries, because we're familiar already with migration. I mean, we had a wave of migration from North Africa and from the zones of war in Iraq and Syria. Over 1 million people migrated in less than a year to Europe. And this is what we can expect. I mean, if we won't deal with those crises, the crisis will come to us.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. We tend to look at it from a westernized world, right? Last question I have before we finish up is, how is this affecting, what is your viewpoint on genetically modified products versus non-genetically modified?
Okay, thank you for the question. I don't know how we reached this point, though it's a whole topic by itself.
Yeah.
GMOs is a whole, I don't think we have the entire time to go into and explain exactly, and I don't know how our audience are well educated on this, and I know there's a big conflict in different countries. I think at the end, when we're looking at what's ahead of us, what we need to cope with when we're looking into the near future of 20, 30 years from now, if we're really going to reach 9 billion people, 2 more billion people on this planet, which we need to feed, with the lack of arable land and the climate change, we need to have all tools in our toolbox to consider, at least, to help us to meet the goal of feeding this planet, the population on this planet. So I wouldn't say we should ban GMOs. I think we should look at them very carefully with all the restrictions taken in place. The same thing we do for accepting a new drug. We all know what is the NIH and the Drug Administration in the US and in Canada when you introduce a new drug. I think we should consider that as a tool. We have new tools coming up with the era of gene editing, which is not yet considered in many countries as a GMO, which give us another tool in the toolbox to help us meet the new challenges and just think of new diseases that can affect, like fungals that affect wheat, which we have example in Central Africa, the Uganda 99 disease that rust, which affects wheat. And if we don't have enough tools to fight back, instead of doing traditional breeding, which can take years and years, and we won't use the new tools, we might lose the train. So we have to consider all tools with the restriction of being cautious and acting with all the tools we know of. Not to rush, but do it in a proper manner.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I would echo what Nir said, and I do, my sense, and we'll see how it all pans out, but my sense is that this pandemic will sear into the public consciousness this idea that there are these, nature still counts, that we're not, I think there's a sense of, man versus nature, and that we're in control. And I think, if anything, this virus shows how vulnerable we are. So whether you look at, for example, bananas, which are essentially, I think 99% of the world bananas that are sold are just one subspecies that are currently, under threat by a pest. So I do think, to Nir's point, like I wouldn't foreclose any tool in our toolbox if it's done intelligently. But I would say on a more macro level, whether it's GMOs or any other approach, I think where you're going to see up and down the food chain, from production to processing to retail, you are going to see, I think, a shift, an increased focus on automation and an increased focus on substituting capital for labor. But I think, if anything, whether it's the cashiers who are under threat because of COVID, so moving to more of a self-checkout approach, or the Amazon automated retail approach, or whether it's these meat processors, you can bet they're going to be looking at automating more and more functions of meat processing plants, or whether it's on farms where labor has been harder and harder to get. So I do think you're going to see this added emphasis and this acceleration of pre-existing trends, because the reality of it is, up and down the food chain, the technology already exists in many cases to substitute labor for capital. It's just a question of how quickly it's going to happen.
I agree. I wanted to thank you both so much, Professor Ohad and Ron Goel, for having been with us today and for the updates and insights into this look at the food industry. And as we know, much more to come as a few weeks come by. And I know Stephen's going to come back on with us.
And thank you again very much, Rose, and thank you to all of our friends who have joined us not only in Canada, but from around the world. And thank you all, and I keep ensuring that you stay home and stay safe and stay healthy. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shalom.